if you can just give us, a brief, personal history. Where you were educated, where you lived,
Oh, okay.
Just so we can have that frame.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. You want me to start from the beginning? I'll start from the beginning.
Okay, like where you've lived. So did you live in New Brunswick at some point or whatever?
Oh yeah,
so
definitely
where you
did
started
live in New Brunswick.
and
So
how that.
I would tend to think that relative to the New Brunswick story, it has to go back to my time in Cambridge, living in Boston. That was where Francoise and I lived before we moved to New Brunswick.
Okay.
And we had lived in Boston. I taught at Harvard, and I was teaching at Imageworks School of Photography. And with affirmative action at Harvard, Adele had to take my place. We needed a black woman, ideally, in junior faculty. So Salah El-Shaks called me and said, "Listen, we heard about you. Are you interested in coming here to New Jersey? And we're starting a new program, and we need a physical planner." So that's how I got started with this. And the first time that we moved, because I came here back and forth for like 3 years, the university paid to fly me back and forth to Boston, and then finally asked me to do more courses. And in the process, I bought a car, which I didn't have a car before.
And just for the record, this is about what year?
We were talking about 1973. We're in 1973, and I think we moved here then in 1974, that we actually physically came. And I think the whole involvement, once I was here, came from my initial impressions of the place, and some very important people to me in this whole redevelopment process. And that is the very first class that I taught, which was in the basement of Livingston College library, had maybe 8, 9, 10 people in it, which was the size of the class, 3 of which became partners of mine in a small consulting organization called Community Alternatives, which we then started in the King Block, which is next to where the Hyatt Hotel is now.
Oh, okay.
So we started up on the 3rd floor of that. And when the bust happened, when the office went belly up at that point because there was literally no work at that recession, we moved. Francoise and I moved into the office because it was like 6,000 square feet. Had our 2 kids there. Bob Schneider, who is really one of those pivotal people.
He was then the head of owned the frog.
No, he owned
J.
August Cafe. Now Bob
was a student.
Was a student at Rutgers,
right.
And he's a funny guy because his dog attended every class at the university and received an honorary degree. Hunter, I still remember the dog went every place this guy went. But Bob, Kathy Andrzejczyk, and David Treach became my first 3 partners. It was Bob Schneider who really introduced me to New Brunswick. And he had this extraordinary gift of collecting people. And Bob was the guy who said to me, "Listen, you should move here because we could have an incredible time. Look at this place. It's deteriorating. It's funky. It's interesting. This could be one of the greatest places to live, any place." And he said, "I want to introduce you to some people." And so we started, going the rounds of people, the antique shops and the bars and what have you. And the number of people that he knew was pretty extraordinary. So it was through Bob.
Since we can't talk
Right.
about
Right.
can you just a brief sidebar?
The sidebar, Bob Schneider started the Frog and the Peach. Started the J. August Cafe on Church Street. He was also the guy who organized the original City of Lights and was the guy who organized all the Oktoberfest, which right before he died of cancer now about 15 years ago, of pancreatic cancer. A huge funeral was for him. But at the last party he had, 50,000 people or more came to New Brunswick, and it's never been repeated since. And it was that cadre of people that I became the urban designer for, and that's how I got involved in the very beginning of this process. And not knowing anything about John Lynch or Mr. Sellers or Heldricks or New Brunswick Tomorrow, none of those folks. It was just an intuitive response that if I'm here and we're going to have our kids here, we already, we shortly after we were here, we had our first child at the hospital and said, "Listen, this is where we're going to stay." And so what we really need to do is to find out what are the resources in this place, and let's work to make this place something really incredible.
And the cadre again of these people, besides Bob Schneider.
Well, it was things like Peter Weeks, Michelle Donato, Susan Starr, were some the folks from Aaron Aardvark. Those were Jim Black, Betsy were.
So these are retail people.
These were primarily retail people,
Uh-huh.
but they were people who, Tom Clark, people who lived here and were willing to move into the city.
It's actually, I hate to bother you with
No.
the sidebar, but it's
Right.
just because
No, that's-
you're giving us a part of this picture that we just don't have at all.
Okay.
Just maybe a sentence on each of those people, just
Okay.
if you would continue.
Susan probably was one of the most important. And she had
Just for the record,
Susan Starr, and she worked with I forget what Arthur's last name at a place called Aaron Aardvark here.
Right.
Susan was an historian from Rutgers, and she was the one who said, Tony, you're living down in the district, down in the Hiram Market district. It's a really important place. And I said, yeah, Susan, it really is an important place, and it resonates with me because that's where we decided to live.
Mm-hmm.
She said, what we need to do is we need to get this on the National Historic Register because it's deteriorating, and the city clearly in '73 when I got here was clearly at a stage of deterioration.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there was a few odds and ends. So Susan was very much part of that. Peter Weeks was the gadfly in town. Peter was I think a PhD student. Peter got involved with the extension of Route 18, which was really the first major element to happen. Because when I came, the two stanchions were standing in the middle of the river there, and Peter was one of those guys who rallied against a green alternative, even at that time, for this big highway going through and covering over the canal. So Peter was a very important part of it. Then there were other folks like Lee Richardson, who was from the Crossroads Theater Company. Those guys, that startup theater company,
Mm-hmm.
and Rick Kahn. Those guys were part of this cadre of people. Then there was the whole Dick Mack, the whole gay community, even gay students we had here, all kind of rallied around that. So there was that group of people. And it seemed to just go on and on and on.
And Jim Black is the owner of the Frog and the Peach.
Jim Black is the owner of the Frog and the Peach.
Who does not want to be interviewed.
Oh, I would suspect not.
He said he wants to forget that part of his life.
Yeah, no, Jim. It's interesting that
he was part of this cadre.
Jim was part of this cadre,
Right.
but it's really interesting when you think about it that the two buildings that still remain down there beside the synagogue.
Mm-hmm.
Is the Deltas, or which was called
Like J. August.
J. August originally, which is the old A&P supermarket chain, and the Home News, which is the Frog and the Peach. Two folks, all three of us lived together in the same building,
Mm-hmm.
and I went to court with one to try to get Jim his building permit. So it's interesting that those are the only two buildings that remained. And what is interesting to me is that once the big defeat happened, that everybody thought was a defeat, Bob stayed on and battled
And I guess
through
you're referring to the Hiram Market.
the Hiram Market defeat, and that the city was not going to go in that kind of funky way that most of these people thought it should go and could go. They all left.
And I guess before we do the Hiram Market, so we had this cadre recognize some of its significance.
Right.
It went on the national.
Oh, they
register.
then
Went on the,
clearly we started
I believe
photographing.
the national and state register.
Yeah, it went on the National State Register.
And then there was a proposal for the Hyatt.
Then there was a
So-
proposal for the Hyatt. Well, there was lots of things that happened in between that period of time. I think that while there was this kind of growing cadre of support people here, there was simultaneously a whole nother parallel track going on with Mr. Heldridge and Mr. Sellers and Paul Abdallah and Abe Wallach and the folks from once New Brunswick Tomorrow had actually started. And they came up with a kind of a sketch plan. The American Cities, I think, did a first sketch plan
Leah Molinaro.
and said, listen, there's a real possibility, there's a real potential here. I think that was really a study that really talked about a potential. And then I think from that one, then they hired I and Pay to do the first building and to do this first sketch of the Hiram Market. which, when we saw it, literally bulldozed everything. It just bulldozed everything. And at that point, I think it added fuel to then the historic preservation fire, saying, listen, this extraordinary resource, I mean, all the stuff that happened down in this place, and the scale and the character, they plan on bulldozing it all.
So actually, it's interesting. We've gotten some background how the American city and then the IMP plan was very, visionary, and in fact, a lot of what happened, a lot of what ultimately happened. Really drew out of that.
Right.
So maybe you can talk a little. You clearly felt otherwise.
Yeah, well, it's hard when you think about that. Now, we had established ourselves up in that third floor. We could walk down the street. There was still a kosher Jewish butcher down the street. There were still people who knew our kids' names. There was groceries on the street, and I was down in the market. So, and once you understood all the kind of the wonderful history that happened down there, you went, this is something that really deserves to be saved, because it's a very important part of American history, and it's a very important part of the history of New Brunswick. And then there was David Meiskens, by the way, who was the pastor of the Dutch Reformed Church, and then there was Father McCarthy. Father McCarthy, always very jovial, very nice, loved his pork and loved his roast beef, as I thought. And he was always the guy who could moderate between, if anybody, Father McCarthy was the one who kind of moderated between the two. But Reverend Meiskens was clearly with us. It was like, okay, this is originally the Dutch community, and we're going to follow along. So if you say there was a spiritual advisor, it was Reverend Meiskens, and then Father McCarthy was always a good guy who was always around and always giving his good support, but also talking to everybody else. So he was a good guy. So I think that as that emerged, to think about getting it onto the register, that group, it was one Thanksgiving, and it was, Francoise and I still smile about it. We think it was all the indigents from New Brunswick. We decided to have Thanksgiving for everybody. I think we had, 90 people over, and people cooked, and the whole loft was full, and people showed movies, and it was really incredible. But the discussion on that was, what are we going to do? This kind of character that we were kind of looking for, of a community of people. I think everybody felt a little bit in jeopardy of what was going on, and the pay plan was there. So they said to me, do you think that you could develop an alternative plan for the Hiram Market? And I said, sure. I'll take it to Rutgers and see what Rutgers has to say about it, and I'm sure lots of students would really be interested in doing that. And it certainly was a huge studio. But the university was also very good, because Ken Wheeler came up to my loft, and he's the only guy that ever approached me and ever came and knocked on my door and said, listen, I got to talk to you. He said, do you mind if I attend your classes? I said, I'd love to have you. He was a historian. You'd love to have him as part of my classes. And he said, I'm just kind of, want to make sure that, we're walking a tender line here now. And I just want to make sure that you're not going to fall one way or the other on this, but try to go down the middle. And so then we started showing him the resources of paying. Here's the building, and here's what happened, and here's its character, and this is why it should be nominated, et cetera, et cetera. And what we did is very judiciously looked at every building, did plans for every building that we thought could be kept.
In Hiram Market.
In Hiram Market. Every building that could be kept. And a lot of them that we knew were wood frame. I'm sorry, we're just not going to be able to keep that. But how do we very carefully put the stuff in between? And I think one of the key contentions was that Church Street used to go all the way down. And we did an alternative plan for a hotel that would have fit on one block with a big walkway through it, as opposed to the 4 blocks it took to build that hotel. And then obviously the pay plan, which said scrape everything down. By the way, they never did the pay plan. It probably would have been better than what's down there, but whatever they did. Everything was
how so
planned.
Just on that nuance,
right?
The pay plan versus what actually happened.
What actually happened? There were issues with both of the plans, but the pay plan never, I believe, called for a hotel at the size that it was. I think that block was another kind of a development block at that point. I think the hotel in some or another was generated out of the UDAG.
Yes, right.
Was generated out of the UDAG because there was two thoughts. One was that Johnson & Johnson clearly were I mean, everybody became fairly aware pretty soon that Johnson & Johnson was clearly calling the shots on this, that the city was so desperate. In fact, they were desperate because I think in 74, 75, I and Bob Schneider and an army of 250 to 300 people hung lights, 14 miles of lights on all the buildings because they couldn't afford to put in seasonal holiday lights in downtown. So Rick Landman, who just retired as provost, I think, at NYU, Ricky helped me all the time. I mean, we were up against ladder trucks, stringing lights across the street. I mean, because we felt it was our town. We needed to do something for the town. It was the holidays, and if they don't have it, then we'll put the energy together to be able to do it. And Berman's hardware store over in Island Park donated most of the lights.
Oh, really?
I mean, it was all those people who just somehow or another through Schneider's energy, everybody got excited about it. Yeah, we'll do that. We'll do that. And so that part of it was subtle.
We have the IMP plan on a smaller footprint.
Right.
And then there was the ultimate UDAG, which was larger.
Which was a much larger plan.
And the preservation alternative, which is what studio.
Preservation
and new construction.
Preservation and new construction. Right.
It came out of a
Can you
studio
talk a little,
class?
which came
About
out
that
of
studio class.
Can you talk a little about that? Just
Sure.
rather than,
Sure. That plan went from Albany Street all the way now to what was in the public housing projects, to Commercial Avenue. That was the study area we looked at. And it went
From George Street down?
From George Street, but not George Street, Nielsen Street
Nielsen.
down. But we were interfacing across the street on Nielsen. So it was a fairly large blocks. So the thought on that one was to do this interesting, I thought, very interesting building that would have an atrium on Dennis Street, so that the Dennis Street, which is the main street where Frog and the Peaches, would continue straight on down. It would go through this big, magnificent entry into a big 5-story, 6-story, 7-story atrium and go directly out to the other side to connect to Johnson & Johnson on the other side. And we thought, wow, we could really make that thing, wrap that around the block, and then wrap the next block around with retail and turn Dennis Street essentially into an entertainment street. That was the thought: bars, restaurants, jazz clubs, and have those 2 blocks that would be completely focused on. You want to stay at the hotel? That's fine. As you can see, the 2 restaurants that survived, that started at the Frog and the Peach and now Delta's, are the remnants of that idea.
Right.
So then what happened, it would continue then down Dennis Street, and then down on Dennis Street, the big parking lot that now has the housing on it. Our proposal at that point was move the Science Center was up for grabs. We thought that Science Center in connection with Rutgers,
What science?
which it's out in the New Jersey Science Center, which is in near the Statue of Liberty Park. That big science center with
Liberty Science.
Liberty
Museum.
Science. Well, it wasn't called. It was called
Right.
the New Jersey
Right.
Science Center. We thought, wow, you imagine bringing that in as the other anchor in this place? What? I mean, this would have been a synergy that would have been just incredible. So we did plans for a full museum on one side, a full hotel on the other side, and this very careful little, infusion into the actual fabric, but turning Dennis essentially into, primarily pedestrian like Austin or Boulder or what have you.
And this is about what time?
This was 19, let me see, I knew exactly when. I think this was, City Life was in 75, and this had to be, David, had to be 79, fall of 79. It's the fall of 79.
2 things. I guess if you can just take us to, the plan and what happened, but then also I'd like to take advantage. You have a very nice
Chronology.
notes on time, which are
Right.
very important. That's what we're trying to do. So maybe you can just take us to the studio and the preservation, the development,
Okay.
and then what happened with that? And then if you, I would be
Okay.
delighted if you could take us
Okay.
through this
Okay.
timeline.
Well, there was a big public presentation of that plan that was done here, and we were back and forth at the city council at the same time, and they were very polite in terms of listening to it, but then we started to get these big editorials in the paper by Abe Wallach and other folks like that, how terrible this was and how it didn't fit into the vision of what the Devco wanted, et cetera, et cetera. And then the frosting on the cake was that they revealed plans for the new Hyatt, and then, quite to everybody's surprise, I mean everybody's horror, they lined up what was considered to be the 3 or 4 best historic preservation experts in the state of New Jersey, and got them up at the public meeting to testify that there was nothing of significance to be kept in the Hiram Market. And when that happened, that night, it was like somebody ran over all of us. That whole group was, that's it, we're out of here.
But aren't they the ones who just helped you get it on the historical record?
Yeah, they did. But once it got de-designated, so they got it on the record. Got it on the record, then then there was another big hearing held to de-designate it.
But these 3 people who they brought in from the state, were they not part of the approval to make this a historic designation?
I have a feeling that they had to go through the state in order to get it.
Right. And so that seems like a conflict of interest.
No
or
kidding.
Something.
No kidding. Big time conflict. I don't know what happened, but they all got up there, read their speeches, and got it de-designated.
I see.
And I had never, I was embarrassed for the profession.
Yeah.
I was mortified how unethical these people were, and I was just so sad that none of this historic value that had such spirit. This place had a feeling to it that nothing else had in this town. That somehow or another they got paid to lie. Because I can't imagine them professionally not understanding what was there, but they needed to get that UDAG grant and they needed to get that hotel in, supposedly in the same way they needed to get Route 18, because if you didn't get 18 and you didn't get the hotel, Johnson & Johnson was going to threaten to leave. And that was always the big threat.
Right.
They're going to leave. Well, we went, all right, so we could find something else. There's enough, but see, there was an arrogance on our part that we really believed that this cadre of 50,000 people, or whatever came to the party, could really do it if we really focused all the energy on New Brunswick and making this the kind of a Austin of New Jersey. It was an arrogance on our part, but one that we thought for almost 5 years that we might be able to pull it off. And to me, that was, once that happened, once they got it de-designated, and once the Abe Wallach thing came out saying, well, this plan doesn't mean anything and it's not according to our vision, et cetera, that was the first straw that people were still, well, but maybe we could still do something. But when the de-designation then occurred, I had never seen such demoralization of a group of people in my entire life. And that's why I have such respect for Jim and Betsy, because they stayed. But out of that whole cadre, Jim and Betsy Black, who run the Frog and the Peach, and God bless those two, because they've done an extraordinary job, and I'm really good friends with them, and I testified at the hearing and what have you. So I know them, I know when they threw, but they stayed, they stuck it out, and Bob stuck it out until he died. But literally everybody else left. There was a mass exodus from the city after of that energy. They all just left.
Did you know somebody named David Willems, who was from sociology? He had a loft. I took cooking classes with him.
I remember the name.
He went through one of the French cooking schools.
Really?
And
What was his
early
loft?
80s. It was on the street down from the street that's now new townhouses or buildings or
Yeah.
condos, going down toward the Frog, not, you
Yeah,
had to
sure,
turn
sure,
right.
sure,
It
sure,
was-
going down to the
It was right
market.
up from the corner where the Frog and the
Ah.
Beach is. And it was in, maybe
I must
5 or
have
6.
someplace, but he's
Must
not
have
a
been
guy
close
who
to where you were.
was not one-on-one with him.
Okay.
Was not one-on-one
So,
with him.
so how long was it actually on the historic register? If you got it onto it and then they designated it, it must have only been on for a few years.
I think it was less than a year.
Oh, really?
I
Huh.
think it was less than a
And
year.
it may have been part of, since there was a UDAC, to have this section 106 review, in which if there is governmental aided action, you then have to.
Oh, you tied that hotel up forever.
Well, if there isn't an historic resource, then it's a
Right.
moot issue.
That's right,
Right.
exactly, David. You had nailed it right on the point. That was the importance of the UDAC. I mean, it had lots of
Yeah.
importances. It got the hotel, but I think that was really clear. They did not want to go through the 106 review process because of the essential importance of that district.
Actually, if you can give us the benefit of,
Okay.
you have some good notes
Well,
on time,
well,
which is important because it's.
It was interesting when you asked me to do this, is that I was, Francoise and I were trying to put this together in the same way, by the way, that I just found the chronology of the first 25 years of the department. I found that, by the way, I also have I found some 80 incredible slides of the Hiram district.
Oh, really?
I just found them, I just digging through my resources and
Uh-huh.
said, do I still have those? So I found some of those, but
The building by building?
almost a building by building, interior shots of that. At least I found one of the reels. Someplace around there's the rest of them. They could be in storage someplace, but at least I found one pretty
Right.
intact.
We'll have to put that on.
Yeah, I think it would be good these little clips. This, I think, is a chronology that tried to get us to really think about that in terms of the chronology that I have is 74 starting community alternatives down in the Hiram Market district with Bob and Kathy and David, and then the summer of 1974 we moved to Hassard Street, right? So I was that, and then that same year we did Highland Park 2000, the plan for Highland Park, and that got some interesting kind of results.
That was a studio? Or
Studio, another one in the studio. 75, our first child was born here, so we had just been here for a while. In September of 75, I did the downtown Metuchen plan, and that December of 75 is when we did the City of Lights. That the city was at that point in serious problems, and it needed to move ahead with something else. Then I think the big one was, once the office went down and we no longer wanted to live over at Hassard Street, we then moved up to the loft. So we moved up there with one child in July of 1976. Because I dug up an old home news article about us in 1976. Like, young couple moves into loft, this
Really?
eclectic, it's a wonderful.
Where was Hassard Street?
Hassard Street is down here about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more blocks down over here.
Okay.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down, and it's really a nice older 1920s apartment building. And Bob lived in the basement, and Francois and I lived up on the second floor. Then 77, we had the second. Then we had the second one in October 77. To me, that was a big year because that was the first year of the Church Street festivals. When Bob said, listen, we're going to close off the street and see if we can gather some people. Let's see if we can find some people who are really interested and will come down to New Brunswick, because it was like getting kind of seedier and seedier, going, we need to get people down here. So he organized the first church. He said, of course, Bob would always say, hey, great idea, let's do this. I'll go deal with the city, but can you do everything else? Like, can you get the vendors, and can you put the lights and get the flags and all the rest of that stuff? So I was always kind of an inherent part of every scheme that he got into. I got into some form or another. I got into him. Then I think it was 77, 78. Devco came along, and that was pretty encouraging for us because I said, well, okay, they're going to do something. And then it was the Route 18 extension. Now, when that happened, and that was the first notion that this big thing was going to be extended, because it had been in the plan. So 78 was I think was a big deal. because it was clearly that once that went in, then Johnson & Johnson started with their major acquisitions to put that headquarters piece. I mean, I think they took 7-8 blocks, you know, just wiped out the 7-8 blocks and then built their headquarters. But I think that really started it, and then I think there was the pay plan that came along. I think somewhere around the 78 area. And then the fall of '79, as I said, it was the Hiram Market plan. We did that, presented that plan. That's a studio plan that we did, right? We did that plan. And then, and at that point, by the way, the major actors that I have here was Ken Wheeler, Abe Wallach, Paul Abdallah, who was really the henchman. I mean, he's the guy that dealt with all of us, and very evil man, I thought. John Heldridge, John Lynch, Roy Epps.
So with Paul, you would have a discussion or present his.
No. It was always tangential. It was always because one of the liaisons was George Gussis. I don't know if you interviewed George Gussis, but George Gussis is a lawyer right over here, and George is a long-time crony, and he's Jim Black's lawyer. So George has been involved with this thing for a very long time. George would be the one who, because George was also my lawyer at the time, he said, you know, Abdallah just hates you. He just hates you. So it was never, and maybe the difficulty was that I never really went and shook hands with those guys and said, listen, can we work together as a team? It's not that I didn't want to do it, it's just that I was pegged as an evil person by that whole group really early on. That's what I thought anyway, and that's what I was told. You can't come up with an alternative plan. I think they might have been a little bit concerned that there was this big cadre of people up there who were like not marching in lockstep, but were really putting a lot of energy into the city of New Brunswick at that point. But as it happened, and some of them are still great friends, and I think that's an important part of it. Spring of '79, I put down nominated for the National Historic Register, and the fall for Hiram Market, right? In the fall of 1979, I have it was deregistered. So I don't think it could have only been 8, 9, 10 months maybe at the most. And then we at that point started to say, listen, the writing's on the wall. We're going to have to find another place. Jim and Betsy said, listen, we're going to go find another place. Bob went and found everybody started to say, okay, that's it, we're going to go find.
Did they stay in New Brunswick?
No. Jim and Betsy wound up in Rocky Hill, in Weird now. We moved down to an old 1700 farm. Right. I think Bob bought a house way on the other end of town because he was still in the tavern business. Mm-hmm. And so he said, I'm going to stay. I think it killed him in the end. Personally, I think he like everybody else is just devastated by this thing. And it was false on our part to have that kind of expectation that this kind of, I keep saying Austin feeling, kind of a place could actually, we thought it could happen because we had enough contact with the bluegrass folks and the jazz folks, and we said we can make this happen. So when it did happen, I mean that was part of it. But be that as it may.
If you say that group or cadre,
right.
Where were students in this and other Rutgers faculty?
No, that was interesting. That was interesting. I think Bryville is the only one of all the faculty who really got interested in this. And Ken Wheeler, of course, was there. But the majority, and the students were always interested, but it as a kind of an academic exercise, and I still see Alan and several of his kids who work on it. They still talk about it. Every time I see them, they talk about Alan Fink is a lawyer now, okay. big lawyer in Manhattan. And Alan, every time I see him, he's going, you remember that project? Everybody thought it was the greatest thing going because it was a real project, it was a real conflict, and people really liked that kind of a thing. But
I asked that because that was just the era of almost the height of maximum feasible participation, and it was the counter to the old physical plan in some part.
Yeah.
it really was flying below the radar for most of
the
students.
It flew below the radar for most of the students, although I remember having a faculty party at our husband Paulo Solari came, and we held it. They asked if we could hold it up in the loft, and I said, of course we will hold it here. So what we were really interested in doing is not only getting, because we were out of Livingston at that point, of getting faculty downtown and seeing kind of what the advantages of what downtown would be. And you had the George Street Theater. He was doing his thing over here in the storefront over there, and Mason Gross was doing its thing down the street in the old department store. So it was a kind of an interesting, kind of funky kind of feeling to the town at that point. But it was one that that really.
And if you had to think about why, especially that was an era where participation in planning and local input was more on the horizon, and that wasn't happening by the students at Rutgers and the planning students who were perhaps most close to that, as well as some faculty. You had to opine, why do you think that was the case?
Why so few participated? I think in some ways, David, probably it was because we never really publicized. You never really publicized it a lot, to get that group. But also, I think there was a kind of a comfort that there was this big cadre of other folks that were looking at me, and primarily me, but other folks to say, listen, can you come up with an alternative plan? We don't know how to do this. Can we come? So somehow or another, I got so involved with them and those, 40 or so students who were involved with it over a period of time. But I never went out to try to rally support for the cause. I just didn't do that. I was so busy trying to figure out how to do a feasible design for each building. Just going and measuring all those buildings.
So did Salah or Kenneth Wheeler or anybody else from Rutgers outside of the planning program take any interest in what you were doing? You said Kenneth came to some of your classes.
Ken came to some of the classes and came up to the loft 2 or 3 times to talk.
But he sort of had to toe the line with J&J's plan.
My guess is that, he always was very encouraging. He never said no. He said, he just keep me informed of what's going on and what you're doing. And we had wonderful conversations with him. And talking about the intricacies of the historic element and how that could become a thematic idea for some of the activities that would happen, because there was so much from early third reading of the Constitution to early first bank notes and riverboats and whorehouses and Wild Bill Hickok and nylon stockings and rubber tire. I mean, it all came from that era. I went, wow. This is really very rich. Plus, it had this fabulous old market in the middle of it. And everybody went, market, yeah, farmer's market. Let's have the biggest farmer's market in central Jersey. Look, we've got all this farmland around it. Let's put the farmer's market back.
So the high, because I don't recall that. I guess I only ever went down that one street. But inside of those buildings, there was a market area, or was it down?
If you go down right center line to the church, because the church steeple of the Dutch Reformed Church is the official clock of the city of New Brunswick.
Okay.
Right? That axis used to have a classic pitched roof market that the trailers would back up to.
A shed-like structure.
Glass-like structure, and they would back up to it, and then outside of that were the trolley tracks.
So it was around the church.
It was that axis down that church,
Right.
wide enough that the wagons could back up and people could walk down covered underneath it. Classic.
Right.
Wonderful old photographs of that market, and then after a while, then it became the trolley stop and terminal, because the trolleys all stopped down there, because it was a logical connection between the trolleys and then the steamboat, which was just across the street, and the swimming pool, which was off of the bridge. Because the kids used to swim, come off the bridge and swim in the Raritan River right there before it got it's not, well, it's not polluted. It's just that it's so full. It's never been dredged out. It's silting in.
We've heard, I guess, another perspective on that the buildings were too far deteriorated in the market now.
They were too far gone?
Too far gone, and to do the infill, because they did think of it at one point about keeping some of them.
And it just wasn't.
And it wasn't financially feasible.
Financially feasible or practical.
Well, here's the difference. Here's the difference between that thinking and our thinking. Rather than having one corporation do it, and they're right. I've seen what Bob went through, and I've seen what Jim went through to restore those two buildings. It takes love, it takes care, it takes work, it takes labor, and it takes, you got your hands get. This is not a corporate way of doing stuff. I mean, from a corporate perspective, I think there's two kind of sheets out there. One is how you do it from a corporate perspective. If it's an old building, let's tear it down. It's cheaper to do concrete block and do it cheaper, blah, blah, blah. Straight. The other one is the love and care that went into the two buildings that remained. And I think the difference here was that I think it was no doubt in our mind, because we had talked to, 5 or 6 developers. I mean, we had developers online. We had people who had done this before who were interested in coming down there if they could have gotten the rights to it. But the rights belonged to Devco. They were the redevelopment authority. They were the purchasers. They were the developers. So here you're condemning and giving back to yourself. It was the most...
Alan Voorhees for a period of time owned some of that property.
Yeah, he did. I mean, there was a whole bunch of people, but it was so interesting because we had these guys come in saying, could you make this work? Yeah, we could make this work. And then Bob would go, well, I'll take those 2 buildings. And Jim said, I'll take that, which he owned 3 of them.
And their thinking was what?
Was
restaurant stores?
Restaurant stores, jazz clubs live upstairs. Organic food, historic antiques. It was just this, everybody had an idea about what they want. And when you think about it, the Gay Club moved down there later, Atomic Particles, which was Michael's antique store, which was like nothing I'd ever seen in my life. There was all this crazy energy in this town of people who said, you come to New Brunswick, you go to Rutgers, and you can't wait to get out of this place. We're going, listen, we're here. I had no intention of saying, okay, I'm going to teach here for 3 years and I'm going to move on to someplace else. That wasn't my thinking. We're going to stay here and we're going to commit ourselves to this place. It's like Ed Bacon, commit yourself for 15 years, you'll get nothing done. We're going to commit ourselves. And there was a lot of people who were out there who had that same kind of thinking.
So did your kids go to the New Brunswick schools?
Yeah, to the first year until we moved out. Then they went to the Franklin schools. Yeah, we got them in the New Brunswick. We said, well, how are we going to change the schools if we don't get our kids in the schools?
Right.
No, just, and I think about it now, and people say to me, oh, the urban renewal is such a terrible thing. I've been relocated twice now to urban renewal, and I will admit it was extremely hard.
And the second time was in
Franklin. Twice now. I got relocated.
Where in Franklin were you?
Well, we owned it was clear on quite clear. We owned Hilltop Farm. We lived there for 16 years. If you go down, South Middlebush Road, right on top of where the reservoir was going to go.
And I was thinking the state acquired that land.
Acquired that land for a reservoir, and the house is still there, but we got moved out of there.
And then you moved to Princeton.
Then we moved to Princeton. So in each case, I will admit that I remember being the last one to get paid my relocation assistance in Hiram Market. Hey, really didn't like me at all. I mean, we got our tires slashed, the heat cut off. I spent Christmas here with my kids and Bob Schneider and Diana. Remember that? They cut the heat off of the building 2 days before Christmas, and we didn't. We had a wood stove in there, and we said, "Listen, this is Christmas. We'll make it through with the wood stove and sweaters." And we did. I mean, but the tires, batteries would disappear, tires would get slashed, heat went off, and people went, well, and Paul would see me, he'd go, he'd give me a finger, I shouldn't do that in television. But Paul just really didn't like me at all.
So we've gotten a perspective on the plan you came up with.
Yeah.
Maybe if you can wear your design planning hat, so how would you evaluate what happened, what actually happened? Let's start with the J&J headquarters.
J&J headquarters is a office building in a park.
Right. I guess that was touted as a office in a park in the city.
Yeah, but the reality that it's an office in a park in the city, with the exception of that absolutely beautiful, double row of trees that they have along the front, it's a public, totally publicly inaccessible piece of land. It's an office in a park.
And like the style and
What about the
materials.
design
Well,
of it?
the design, it was interesting because we have the whole photographic collection of that building going up. What was amazing to us when we watch it go up is the tower. The tower has the back curve. It's a back curve. Must be, I'm guessing, it's been a long time, 3 to 4 feet thick, solid
Really?
concrete. And then the concrete is covered with an anodized aluminum paneling that's just acid resistant.
Uh-huh.
This tower was meant to take a bomb. This was designed that it would never go. I mean, we never. And of course, you put a concrete, you can do a thin shell, like Jefferson did with his curved walls. This is a big, thick wall against that curve. So that building was meant never to go anywhere. So that was an interesting one. And of course, all the corner offices. It was all kind of interesting and nice. But the reality of it was to me, it was anti-urban. It was a suburban solution to an office building. Essentially a gated office park, if you will, with their own internal campus on the inside of it. And and that's the way they had been with their earlier building, and it's a corporate mentality, and they did it. But the thing I think that was ingenuous of them to say, we're not doing this because we want to produce a great thing or we want to do something really great for the city of New Brunswick, which was kind of touted because all these people were going to go to these jewelry
Right.
stores and it was going to be this big economic development thing. Then they got a 25-year, whatever it was, got a tax abatement with no payment back.
Payment with that.
Whatever it was, but it was something minuscule, relative, we thought. And then they got the grant for the UDAG for the Hyatt, which they turned around and bought.
Right.
I mean, they are very clever people, very clever, very cost conscious, and they got everything that they wanted. And they got their little. Somebody called it. They got the. What did they call it? They got the picture frame.
Right.
They got the picture within the picture frame.
Right.
They got what they wanted, and I don't. I mean, certainly they're here. They're a presence. They're important. But so that building was one thing, and so but that was kind of written off, saying okay, that's fine, but then let us have a piece of the rest of it. At least have a little piece of the rest of it. No. We couldn't have. We couldn't have
Like
it
some of
either.
your perspective on the Hyatt and
The Hyatt's
Church
okay.
Street,
Okay, the Hyatt's terrible. I think the Hyatt's one of the worst designs I've ever seen. I mean, even for a Hyatt hotel, that one is really pretty miserable. I mean, just the construction, the material, just to have done it in brick would have been better. The step up at the bottom, I don't know what it does. The termination of Church Street, you can't even walk across Church Street to get to the front end of the hotel. The sidewalks don't even continue. You've got to walk across
Right.
the grass.
Right.
It is such a bad design. From an urban design perspective, from a scale perspective, from a materiality perspective, to me, it was just awful.
How about Kilmer Square?
Kilmer Square, the only thing that, if anything got saved out of Kilmer Square, was that they left the space that the original market was. And they kind of emulated the scale, although the buildings that were there before were bigger than what's there now. They kind of downsized it, if you will. They kind of miniaturized it, but the key thing is that they at least left a piece of that space that somehow or another responded positively to the church facade, which, by the way, is now falling apart. That it's really in serious trouble. I mean, you can see it's
Are you talking about the Christ Church?
No,
or the
Christ
Devco?
Christ Church. No, Father McCarthy played the game, and he got a big thing from J&J, and they sprayed the walls, and they did all the stuff that did that. And by the way, Bob Schneider, another key important, is one of the key factors as to why that church is in a good condition that it is now, because Bob figured out, and I think it was, I'm not sure. I remember being part of it, but not as
New
clever.
Jersey Historic Trust grant or something?
Well, no. What he did, he said to Father McCarthy, because Father McCarthy would come over and have a fraternity bar, and he was always a jovial kind of guy. When he took off his collar, we liked him. He was just a nice guy, right? And he said, if we only could get some additional revenue in. And so we had done the cemetery over here, the Jewish cemetery in the ward over here. Picked up all the stones that we could, put them all into one place. And that was a student project that Rutgers did. And put a memorial path through it. But it had been an abandoned Jewish cemetery. Plus there's several other abandoned cemeteries you can't even see in this town, which are covered with blacktop. But his cemetery was still there. And Bob said, well, in his typical engineering fashion, he said, listen, if we draw all these graves and you look at all the space in between, and he being a farm boy like me, we could figure out, we just had people cremated and we put them a post hole in between. How many post holes could we get in there? So I think one night we just doodled on it. I think I said, well, we could get like 4,000 more post holes in here. Well, that's what's happened. And Bob was one of the first guys that got buried. Cremated him, and one morning, 6 o'clock or something in the morning, at some time, we came and dug a post hole and poured his ashes in it, and now you got those memorial things. That everybody who gets a post hole now has relatives that come there, because after second generation, nobody goes there anymore. I still go there. His kids go there. So Bob flowed money into Father McCarthy. So I thought that was the cleverest thing I'd ever heard about, and it worked very well. It's right here in New Brunswick. It's a very unique way of, I think, dealing with that. So Father McCarthy and the trust, they kind of work together, but Myskins, because he had sided with the wrong side, he got blackballed. I'm not saying blackballed, but somehow or another, there was less favoritism towards, in fact, I don't think he got any resources at all. I don't know, I'd have to look at that, but I know that the church isn't really...
How about the Church Street Mall?
The Church Street Mall, first of all, never...
And any thoughts on Old Man Rafferty's after we talk about
Yeah, some clearer things about Old Man Rafferty's, because that's where the building next to it was where the original J. August was, in that building, which is a cigar building, whatever it is right now. And the one next to it then, again, we had detailed plans, because Bob Schneider was planning on buying that building. That's where J. August...
You mean Old Bay?
Old Bay. Old Bay, Old Bay. Sorry, that one, David. The Old Bay, that one on the other side. Bob was planning on doing. So I remember days spending up there measuring that building, all the columns, and getting it, because he wanted to expand J. August into that building. That was the thought, to anchor that corner. But then when the rest of the mall came along, we thought, well, that's a good thing. But
and how do you think from a design perspective?
Well, I think the center corridor, and that's just always been problematic because it never connected to anything. Number one. And number two, they violated all the basic retailing rules by putting it up on a platform without making that platform continuous, because he had, which used to be PSC and G down at the other end, which was on grade, and then you had a kind of step half upgrade. It was doomed, in my opinion, it was doomed for failure because they violated all the basic rules. Plus, they violated everything that was there before. Right. I mean, even the stuff, Tops appliances was sitting there. That was a land office business at the corner. But it was on grade. I mean, you have to take retail on grade.
Tops and Gabowitz.
Tab and Gow, whatever it was. We call them Tops, Mr. Tops. So anyway, so I think they violated that. And then you had that little park in the corner, which on City Lights, by the way, we put the first big Christmas tree on that corner because it was an empty corner. Still is fenced in. Yeah. It's still fenced in. So like I don't understand why Old Man Rafferty's just can't expand into that space. It would be fantastic with Starbucks next to it. It'd make a great corner, but there's a certain tightness that happened because of the corporate control, I think. That somehow or another never allowed people to have much fun. You were there on a 9 to 5 basis, and this you had a total line, but you were never, don't have too much fun, because that's not what we do. And I have a feeling that, and we were all for making money and having as much fun as conceivably possible in this town. But that was a thought. So when they cut that corner out, I thought, well, that's kind of too bad. But they left the building next to it where
Starbucks.
The Starbucks is now. And then the one next to it was Meisel's drugstore. And that one, we always had great plans for that one. And of course, Dick Mack the gay bar was supposed to go across the street.
Oh.
Well, none of that happened. I mean, it seemed every time that a counter proposal came up for it, it was somehow or another not what people were really looking for.
The Golden Triangle, I guess the office by the train.
The office by the train, the wedding cake, as it's called by folks. You know, despite the step back in the building and all that stuff that was done with that, I thought, well, if you're going to put step backs, please, dear God, cover it with trees so it really looks like a green thing up there. Well, that didn't happen. And then, of course, what I was concerned about is the extension of George Street. That when you come from George Street, on one side it's completely dead because you got the Johnson & Johnson wall. On the other side of it, I thought, well, there's the street that you're going to have to put all the activities on it. Now it's just this awful walking experience of people getting from here to Old Queens, which is our most sacred relic. And that walk is not very, from a pure interactive with street level, that should be one of those streets.
You mean where the garage is?
Yeah, it's growing. There's a whole garage edge there.
Right.
So that one was a little bit, that building itself. But, you know, it was, look, we're bringing all these new buildings in town, and I think it was a TIF. I think maybe it was one of the first TIFs. I'm not really sure.
Well, they always use the payment in lieu of tax.
Yeah,
which was a variation of
they negotiated something on that building to put that in, but I think everybody was very happy to see and of course, there's the picture frame. Everything around the park is now complete, and the old PSE&G building with that wonderful Trump toy at the end, that got torn down.
Right, that was the power station.
That was the power station, yeah. And so now the picture frame was totally complete. And after that, I had worked for Roy Epps and was on the board of the Urban League. You know, that was another plan. We said, listen, this needs major work over here. Major work. That one also.
So was Roy Epps in?
Roy Epps was
line
always
with
part of the
J&J?
mix because Roy was really hoping that the revitalization of the city would simultaneously mean a revitalization to the second ward. Because the Hungarian, the fifth ward, I believe that's the Hungarian one, they had been pretty solid over there. So there was this, you know, this railroad split in town. You know, it was like you had the Hungarians and white folks essentially on one side of the railroad. On that little strip in between, you had the Spanish, and then other side of the railroad was essentially, you know, mixed Afro-American. And that was. And
so, if we can talk a little about, you know, how redevelopment affected the neighborhoods.
Right. I think you cannot talk about that without talking about Mount Laurel. I think that and I don't know what the numbers on it are, but I think the amount of new housing that came in because of that was primarily transfers from suburban communities into New Brunswick for Mount Laurel payments. And that's how a lot of that revitalization occurred. The Fifth Ward study must now be 25 years old, and literally, beside that, I don't think very much else has really been done over there. You know, we did Feaster Park. They put the school in Feaster Park. The volunteer work did the Jewish cemetery there, but we did that primarily. But not a whole lot more. Some few trees have been planted. And Roy has been working all these years, you know, and then he had to split with the Urban League and became the Civic League and what have you. But not much has been done over there. But the advantage of it was that there was this money coming in from, I think, the transfer of funds from Mount Laurel. But I think you got to focus that way more then. And then when the public housing projects, you know, because they couldn't sell the plan for Hiram Market because the public housing projects were there. So they had to do something about the housing projects. And then Klugman, or whatever it is, came and did the investment in the first piece down here. And that began to move ahead. So that was a good sign. Started to clean that neighborhood, which was festering down, because we had lived down there, and can't tell me how many times our cars got busted into and radios got stolen. That's why Francois finally said, we can't live down here. I'm not going to. I mean, somebody had stabbed Bob with a knife.
In a moment, I'd like to ask you, where do you think the city of New Brunswick is going? But before that, any further thoughts and observations about what has happened? You we got some design reaction.
Yeah, you know, you have to look at this as a kind of an experiment in corporate redevelopment, and as that model goes, it's probably got to be considered to be very successful. I mean, they had a goal and they accomplished it. However, they had to go through the political and legal and the judicial structure to do it. They did it. And you have to, in this time when things are so difficult to get done, you have to respect the fact that the corporation came along and did it, and is still doing it. It's still, across the street, it's still better. But but I think what's happening in some cases at the urban design is in some cases getting better than what it was before. And I think that's a lot to do with who's directing Devco and what have you now. But the building across the street is a very formidable, and I like that building across the street. I mean, I think that the city has kind of grown up. The 30-story tower, I like. The city is kind of growing up.
You mean Bore's building?
Yeah, the city is growing up.
I guess if we can just take that, move forward, where do you see New Brunswick in 10, 20 years?
That really depends upon, to me, what happens with what's going to happen both with the economy, and secondly, it seems to me that more and more people, well, there's two things. One, is New Jersey going to grow or is it not going to grow? And if I listen to what folks here, which I totally believe, I don't think we've got much growth potential.
And of course, New Jersey cannot grow, but some people can come to New Brunswick.
People can come, well, that's the next thing. So one, you have to say that, okay, that's at one level. But you could get people to come here, and I think the combination of the theaters now, and it's got a big reputation for restaurants now, might be able to do that. But I still yet, in my mind, cannot feel a soul in this place. I can't.
So you
that sense of community that I once experienced, it just doesn't.
So
I don't get a sense of it.
It's not like you would have an interest in moving back.
No.
Because that spirit that.
No. It's not that. It's not that. We lived here. We lived here for 7 years, and now, we keep thinking, well, Francois is going, well, Tony, how long what are we going to do next? And I'm going, Francois, I don't know what we're going to do next, but I don't intend to retire because. But right now, if my wife had her choice, we'd either be living in Manhattan or be living in Paris, and she's looking at places in both of them.
Did you ever talk to Don when he bought the house? Did he talk about how he felt? Was there any
Don was
soul,
so. I mean, Don, very as quiet as Don was.
Don Krugerberg.
Don
Yes,
Krugerberg.
Don
I sailed with him a lot, and I he went through lots of things as well.
Right.
But he was really happy when he moved down here.
Yeah.
The kids, he had PhD seminars down there, so he'd have parties down, and it was like a proximity to the school. So Don, I always say Don was one of those kind of pioneers who drank the Kool-Aid and said, listen, I'm going to move down there, and really enjoyed it.
Right.
And he had his boat and his open space, other places, and therefore had that kind of correct balance of urban and open.
But you weren't there anymore when the school was built there, so it was a totally different.
Oh, no. By that time, after that big disillusionment, we moved out to Hilltop Farm and restored that gem. For 17 years it took me to restore that one. And then we moved on to downtown Princeton, which, by the way, we really liked. I mean, we lived on a little street with no cars and no parking and nothing. But we knew everybody on the street, and everybody. It was the only time I had that kind of feeling. And Francois said, we kind of missed that, not having that. I'm going, well, Francois, you can always, we still got the house, so you could always move back to Princeton. But it's different where we are now. We're totally isolated where we are now, and for me, somehow or another, that's okay right now. That's okay.
If I go back, you were talking earlier about this was a successful, corporate oriented.
Yeah, big time.
And to that extent, it's transferable. I think you would like to have seen an alternate universe of a more, multi-use, multi-ethnic, multi-income.
Yeah, I would like to see the balance.
Downtime. But let's, looking at the corporate model.
Right.
What were some of the factors that made it successful here? So if I could maybe just mention some things and I can get some reaction.
Yeah.
One was the support of a major corporation.
Oh, clearly.
J&J. The presence of Rutgers University.
Right.
The fact that it's the hospital and the growth of the medical and do you think scale was a factor? There's the fact that you could wrap your arms around a city of 40,000 and it's much harder, to do it in a city of 200,000, like in Newark. And Newark and they're very
it's a very, very interesting question.
But do you think that has something to do?
Yeah, no, I think it did have something. I think it really did have something to do with it. But I think that within these cities, in a redevelopment scenario or a building scenario, that you have to break the cities down into smaller component pieces. They're districts, if you will, in the Lynchian sense. That the Hiram Market in downtown was kind of one district. That was kind of our milieu, if you will. And then there was the second ward in Douglas, and then there was the third, then the third ward, and then there was the other elements of, this growing Middlesex Hospital becoming this major teaching hospital, and then there was St. Peter's down the way, and then there was the county, and then the two colleges. We went, and a river location. It's like, this, plus all this great old historic fabric, which when we moved, it was really cheap. It was really cheap. We're going, let's start buying. If we had money, we would have. I think everybody would have, because everything was so cheap. With that, so all those components were there, and of course, the major corporation and Rutgers, which I think has, quite honestly, has longer staying ability than even Johnson & Johnson does. Rutgers is going to be here forever. If there is such a thing. But I don't know about that corporation. If it wasn't decided one day it's going to move its headquarters to Taiwan because the chief executive officer of it wants to be in Honolulu or something. I don't know. It has that power to do that because they're now a world organization and they can go anywhere.
But Rutgers can't pick up.
But Rutgers is not going to pick up and move. And its students are a huge potential market, which I don't think is being capitalized on. That's just me personally, but I don't think they're being capitalized on, other than the ward over there, which 8 kids are living in one house and are being built for so much.
If I can just mention, going down this list of what are some factors that the stability of city government. The fact that you haven't had, and you can view that in different perspectives.
Yeah, I would view that in different perspectives. When I started, the first mayor was caught in illicit sexual acts. So I forget what his name.
Is that the guy who moved to the west?
Yeah. So that was the first one I had. So that was my first experience. But oh my God, this guy got caught in the parking lot doing what? So he was gone to that. Well, okay, this is New Brunswick, right? And then the people that we met on the console seemed like nice people, but somehow or other they just went wherever they were told to go. And then of course then there was the tremendous influence of John Lynch and his dad, on the judiciary that he had set up for all those years. The son walked into like the perfect greed opportunity that John walked into, and then what he married into gave him another whole venue which nobody could have ever thought about. I heard lots and lots of stories, none of which I can confirm, but I heard lots and lots of stories of people who actually saw certain events. I never had a trust in that. I never had a trust in that, other than that they were there to say, okay, we'll just help you along. Because the Devco folks were the people who were really controlling what was
How
going on.
about Devco as a model?
Devco as a model for a city, I think worked. Look at it. It really worked remarkably well, but they were by themselves very insular. I mean, they never really tried to reach out, although they'll say that was not their job. Their job in the Brunswick Tomorrow, that was a job to be able to reach out. But even then, it was clear that they had a plan, that plan was going to move ahead, and the city government just,
And I guess I should have mentioned Devco and the Brunswick Tomorrow.
Yeah, they were
here in the Brunswick Tomorrow with some sensitivity to the social, and Devco saying we're going to focus on development.
On the development,
become good at it.
Right, right.
And local government may not have that expertise.
Right.
It can't move so nimbly.
Yeah, no, that was true, but they also consolidated power, I think. I mean, an extraordinary amount of power was consolidated into Devco in order to make this happen. And maybe that's what has to happen in order to get redevelopment to move ahead at this kind of gigantic scale.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's one of the lessons that now with Kilo and all the rest of the things that are going on in redevelopment, there may not be much opportunity, if ever again, to do any really large-scale redevelopment projects. So it might have to be done on a much more incremental kind of a basis.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the regional plan things, whether it's Minneapolis or it's downtown Portland, I mean, there's a whole series of models of people who have worked together with communities in order to make those happen. And unless you've got a very big government, and that government is really efficient, you need this. To me, you need this secondary redevelopment authority in order to move something like this ahead. I think that model is the correct one.
Actually, just an aside, I guess some revisionist thinking on Robert Moses and the role he played. And again, this is not for this discussion, but he was cast as an utter villain for 30 years, and now maybe you're a little thinking you needed some of that consolidation of power to move ahead to get things done.
Well, it's interesting. I'm reading Gibbons's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and the parallels between what's happening now in the United States and what happened back then are too uncanny to believe. Consolidation of power in order to get stuff done, bread and circus, keep people prosperous and keep them entertained, and then everything else will be illusionary towards the fact that we're becoming satiated and we're losing our abilities to do lots of other things. I think that's a kind of an interesting parallel. But I still, in my mind, David, think that if I had a choice between one person doing it, unless it was a great emperor or military dictator, which the Caesars were, or lots of people having an ability to work into the process with a plan, with a grand vision, I think I would choose the latter.
But somebody's got to have the plan and grand vision.
You got to have the plan. That's what I said. You got to have the plan and grand vision, but then let lots of people help you in the process, and let it become a little bit deviant, if you will. I mean, I just looked at a bunch of images of Vancouver and Portland and Seattle. Mm-hmm. The stuff that's going on out there is just fabulous. Mm-hmm. But it's all kind of human garden, funky, interesting, old, new, and here it just didn't quite gel, because there's still, to me, and never has been, a clear vision of where the city wants to go. Where do they want to go with French Street?
Right.
Where do you want to go? Where do you want to go with the connection? Yeah, the high school way out in the middle of nowhere, out there. Stick it as far as you can, like the welfare office, next to the welfare office, as far on the edge of New Brunswick as you could possibly stick it. I mean, I don't know who makes these decisions, but it seems to me that the future of cities is going to be about sustainability. It's going to be about human contact, sustainability, and green, and it's got to be about community, because life is becoming tougher, people are becoming more depressive, and so the cities have got to be the revitalizing factor in people's souls. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can go be Thoreau and go look at nature and say, well, it's wonderful to have nature, but why not have nature in a city? Why not have buildings that grow trees? Why not have green markets? Why not? to get this energy into the city. That's why so many kids probably like Manhattan now, or Jersey City, I mean, or Hoboken. I keep saying Hoboken. I can't, because I go to Hoboken a lot, going, the number of strollers on the street is becoming incredible. It's like this army of strollers. and it's wonderful. Old people, old lady walk by with a flower, and there's a guy, and there's young kids, and then there's people with purple hair, and it's like, oh wow, isn't this cool? And so that notion that a city can revitalize itself in that way needs this grand vision. It needs a plan. But then my fear is that the days of corporate dominance in the redevelopment sphere may be over. But on the other hand, the other side of me thinks that may be the only way to do it in the future, because the only way we're going to get stuff done is going to dictate it from up above for some form or another. So
we have those tensions.
So I think those tensions, New Brunswick and somehow or another parallel those two things which are happening. This kind of more free market with an overall vision against a corporate vision, and you just do. We'll just keep you kind of, and I think that would be a very, very interesting two-sided thing to explore, because I think those are the two sides of urban. I think that's going to be two sides of rebuilding cities. I think.
Tony, I know you have to go teach sometime soon.
Yeah.
But I have a question about community involvement. According to people involved from the J&J side and through NBT, there were community discussions, and apparently John Helbridge was one of the people who convened groups of people, and Roy Epps was supposedly involved in those. What were they? Were there actually discussions?
We went to, no. There were. I didn't think there. We were told this is what you're going. This is what we're going to be doing. They were like similar. The only parallels that I could think about was the same way that the hearing was held on the extension of Route 18. The plan was done. We're going to have public meetings on the plan. Well, what public meetings? I mean, okay, we're going to do it. It's going to be
invite people's comments?
Oh, there were people standing in line. We put 2 o'clock in the morning. You still had your number to comment on the thing, and they all dutifully sat there saying yes, yes, yes. Very good idea. Nice. And it was pro forma. It always is pro forma in those kinds of cases. It can't be anything else. Because they have a plan. It's not a plan that's generated from the bottom up. It's a plan that was generated from the top down. And that's very different than the kind of work I've been doing for 30 years. I believe that you listen to people at the bottom level, you'll get the financing, you'll get the ideas, and you'll get the enthusiasm to pull it up from the bottom up. It's what worked in Atlanta, that's what worked in Austin, that's what worked in Minneapolis, that's what worked in Milwaukee. That's, to me, I really like that idea. But strong leadership at the top with a vision about where you want to go. And then you can get lots of little people involved. People who are selling gelatos on the street can get involved. And somebody can start something which is smaller. Or, so they're really actively involved in the participation of community in a city. And I think that still, to me, is the goal.
I know you have to go. Any further thoughts? And it's not like it ends here.
No. All in all, I mean, you look at what's happening, and I kind of wish it could accelerate itself a little bit further, because I think there's maybe still some opportunities here. I must admit that it is nice to see that it has gone as far as it has, as quickly as it has. It's not what I would have imagined the vision for it to be, but it is what it is. And believe me, I think it could have been worse. So nonetheless, it is what it is. It's here, and our job is to continue to try to, as much as we can, pump as much energy into this place as conceivably possible. But I just regret that all those folks who had all that initial energy all abandoned the place for all practical purposes.
Why do you think Rutgers didn't play a more important role?
Well,
as a partner?
Well, this is only total hearsay on my part. But again, it was either you go along with us or else we'll cut our endowments, we'll cut that, you don't get the building. There was always this notion that Rutgers was going to give, J&J was going to give Rutgers the building.
Right.
And that was this big, there was this kind of veiled threat. But again, I only got that from this discussion with other people who were were secretaries to Ken Wheeler, all those people I knew, it was all the underground.
Yeah.
It was all those. But did you know what? He had a meeting with so and so and blah blah blah. And he went, really? So that's how it all occurred. So I think that's how Rutgers. But I think Ken was walked a very thin line on that thing, not wanting to discourage me and us, but on the other hand, not saying, hey, it's a great plan, we'll support it. Rutgers will come out and support this thing. He couldn't do that. He couldn't do that, and I understand. I understand that.
So we'd like to follow up. I think you have some very unique materials.
Yes. Yes.
So we'll have to
very happy to give you those materials.
Again, we have to have a discussion how to bring what we're doing into a synthesized, shorter version, which we'd like to talk about.
Yeah, that's something that, because you need to get it down to a half hour. Yeah, you got to get it down to an hour at the most.
Because all this is great for archives, but we need to pull out of this, the 45-hour version, and then to have some visual display that goes in the library and at Rutgers, etc. So that's, I view this as a two-part.
Well, if you look at
one is a video and the other is just an exhibit, so to speak.
Right, but also within the context of video, you could have a lot of those exhibit pieces. Could be buried inside it.
The video should be a standalone.
Yeah.
Of course, everything we're doing will be available. We then this is transcribed, the interview, and we can look at it, and then you will get a copy at some point just to make sure that we got it right.
It's accurate.
How many hours of stuff do you have?
Well, 17 times